Welcome to another episode of the Dialectic at Work, a podcast dedicated to understanding Marxian theory, the dialectical logic that makes its philosophy distinguished from other philosophies, the theory of surplus value that allows it to analyze actually existing capitalism. I'm your host, Shahram Azhar. I'm a professor of economics at Bucknell University. Most professionally trained neoclassical economists have never bothered to read Marx's Capital Volume 1, let alone know about the existence of two other theoretical volumes, as well as three other volumes on the history of the concept. Yet, believe it or not, there is a lively discussion within bourgeois economics on what Marx missed. Typically, these thoughts and opinions begin with the sentence, but Marx didn't account for fill in the blanks. While that is in general a terrible approach to doing any kind of analysis, in this particular episode and the next few episodes, we're going to deal with that particular issue. This week, the dialectic goes to explore some of these alleged absences in Marx's project called Das Kapital. And since most of these absences, quote unquote, stem from an ignorance of Capital Volume 2 and 3, we devote the next few episodes to these two volumes. With me to make sense of all of this is a man who's devoted his entire life to understanding, thinking about, as well as perfecting the art of teaching Marx's Capital Volume 1, 2, and 3, as well as what we will call later the theories of surplus value. Let's welcome Professor Richard Wolff. How are you, Professor?
All right, Shahram, Professor Azhar, I want to be as polite as you are being, but we have gotten to know each other, so we can dispense with it, but I appreciate the thought.
Yes. Rick, I want to transport you back, if you like, into Thompson Hall at UMass Amherst, where you and your co-thinker, Stephen Resnick, and co-author Stephen Resnick used to teach a course called Econ 797, which dealt with a two semester long study on Capital Volume 2 and 3. So I wanted to ask you the first and perhaps the most obvious question. Why did you and Steve devote so much attention to Capital Volume 2 and 3?
I guess there are two basic reasons. One, you've summarized yourself a moment ago. Most of the students that we encountered, most of our colleagues, if they knew anything about Marxian economics or Marxist theory, it was based on whatever out of volume 1 of Capital they had the opportunity to read. And that is a very small part of all that Marx was able to do. I was once told by someone who knows the bibliographical history better than I do that for quite some time in the United States, Volume 1 was available in English much more readily than Volumes 2 and 3. And so that may have contributed to this tendency, although my deep suspicion, there's some kind of noise. I don't know what to do about that.
No worries, please go ahead.
Keep going?
Yes, please.
Okay. The second reason has to do with the fact that Marxian economics is perfectly able to handle a whole raft of topics that have formed a kind of excuse for the profession. They avoid Volume 1 with some difficulty, but they don't seem to have any difficulty avoiding Volumes 2 and 3 because basically the profession functions as if they don't exist. So Marx is understood maybe to have some theory of surplus or surplus value, and maybe understood to have some notions of transitions from feudalism to capitalism, material in Volume 1. But when it comes to understanding commodity exchange or how the production of surplus on the one hand interacts with the exchange of commodities on the other, then it is asserted endlessly that their neoclassical theory comes into its own. It is a theory of markets. It is a theory of supply and demand. And Marx didn't have much to say about it. And if he did, well, it has been updated and made much better by the neoclassical tradition that arrives shortly after Marx dies. That's nonsense. I mean, literally nonsense, because Marx did do all of that. You don't have to obviously agree with it. You don't have to find it persuasive. But to say that it didn't happen and to ignore the distinctive theory of exchange of commodities, of money and banking, of commercial versus banking versus industrial capital. These are arguments that Marx developed in great detail over hundreds of pages of volumes 2 and 3. And the notion that you can breezily ignore it all tells us more about the person who does that than it does about the material being ignored.
Wow, that's amazing. Rick, I wanted to ask you about the preface, and I wanted to start right at the beginning of Volume 2, because we want to devote a lot of attention to how to read Volume 2, etc. Now, one problem that readers encounter as soon as they read the preface of Volume 2 is that his friend, Friedrich Engels, basically had to get the book together, organize it, and even write some parts in that particular book. And he says something, so Engels wrote one of the prefaces, and he says that Volume 2 may not provide the same kind of excitement as Volume 1, because this volume is mostly about the struggles between one bourgeois and another. And I found that fascinating. Would you like to comment on Engels's preface and why he kind of, he was a really old man by that time, and then, so why did he, obviously, how did he think about the project, and why does he say that this is, why was he worried that this might not generate as much excitement as Volume 1?
Well, there are a number of issues that you raise here. Let me do them one by one. A simple matter is that Marx died before he could put together what we now know as the notebooks leading up to the material in Volume 2. He had written it over a long period of time. The order of the volumes that appeared in publication is not identical with the order in which the arguments were developed, when they were articulated in a different time pattern. So what you're seeing is a Volume 1 in which Marx, as a writer, as a broadly educated thinker, fluent in many languages, brings together the theoretical nuggets that he figured out, to his credit, the theoretical insights he was pioneering, but it also had the polish. For example, there are many quotations from Shakespeare or from the Italian writer Dante and others that are woven into the text to illustrate, to show a parallel, to give credit to when a great artist understood what they perhaps weren't able to put into the logic of an economic argument. So there's a polish and a finished quality, and Engels is being modest. He didn't have the command that Marx did. He never did in that way. And he wanted to make it clear that the book wouldn't read with the erudition and the polish that Marx brought to it, because he was in a rush, while he was still alive, to bring together the key arguments of those notebooks into a volume. And then people should know that Volume 3 takes the same problem another step, because by that time, Engels had also died, and the volume was produced and published by the student of Karl Marx and Engels, the German Marxist Karl Kautsky, an important theorist in his own right, an important thinker within the German Marxist socialist movement at that time, but someone who brought both his skills and his limits to that volume. So they really are, it's a collective work of three different people. Now, that's the first thing. The second thing is bourgeois economics deals with the capitalist as a uniform thing. So, and modern economics has picked that up. The capitalist is a capitalist, and they're always kind of doing the same thing. They are buying inputs, they're combining them in production. How they do that in production is given by the technology. It really doesn't, all that the capitalist does is go and find the cheapest source of the inputs that the technology dictates you have to have. And then he has to worry about selling the output. But they're all alike in this way. You know, the banker sells banking services, and the merchant sells merchanting services, and the industrial capitalist sells his goods and or services. They're really all the same. This is, for Marx, a radically different theory. And one of the important things that theory does is dissolve the issue of the surplus, the issue of exploitation, by generalizing it across people who are in radically different places in an economy, in a capitalist economy. And therefore, Marx organizes them by differentiating them given the way the system works, whereas bourgeois economics does not do that. It looks at them as all more or less equivalent, but no more different than, say, a capitalist making ice cream is different from a capitalist making software programs. Those are differences, and we pay attention to them. But in terms of what they are doing as the core activity, no. Everybody is buying inputs, using technology to transform them, and then selling the outputs. It renders the capitalist almost marginal, almost secondary. I remember noticing when I was taught this material, first at Harvard, having my teacher say, production is a black box. We're economists. We don't know what goes on there. It doesn't really matter. That's something the engineers do who are hired by the capitalists. For us to understand the system, we have to understand the motivation of the capitalist in going into business, the risks the capitalist takes, the waiting for outputs over time that the capitalist has to endure. All of it very carefully setting us up not to see what Marx foregrounded. Now, the people who did this at the end of the 19th century, the neoclassical revolution, Jevons in England, Valois in the French-speaking Swiss part of the world, Karl Menger in the German part, they knew what they were doing. But their students ever since forgot their need to negate the Marxian argument. They were political economic warriors. That's why they were clearly against Marx's labor theory of value, had to dismiss that. Why, probably, arguably, their greatest student, a German named Eugen von Böhm-Bawerk literally devoted himself to explaining why their way of looking at the economy, where everything is an exchange of the capitalist with the worker, of the capitalist with one another, and so on, he devoted an exposition of that to a direct attack on Marx's value theory. And so you understand what they were about. But the 100 years since then have been people doing that kind of work without an acknowledgement or an awareness of what the ideological function was that made it happen in the first place.
Wow. So when we read volume 2, which is, and he's called it, or Engels has called it, The Circulation of Capital. That's the title of the book. Volume 1 for our audiences is called The Production of Surplus Value, which we covered with Professor Wolff in a couple of episodes ago. So going back to our conversation, I want, for those of you who haven't seen that episode, please go back and look at that particular interview. Rick, you explained in that particular episode what Marx meant by the term circuit of capital in volume 1. And there you explained how it's an analytical tool that Marx uses to explain how surplus value is produced in capitalism. But now at the start of this book, we suddenly learn that there's not one, but 3 circuits. There's the circuit of production, the circuit of money capital, and the circuit of commodity capital.
Right.
What the hell is all this about?
Yeah. Okay. Here, what Marx is trying to do here, and pardon me for saying so. Obviously, I've spent a lot of time on this. I found this one of the most brilliant works I have ever encountered, because what he achieves there is so difficult. And what I mean by that is he does an exposition of what the relationship is between the production of surplus on the one hand and the circulation of money and commodities on the other. An exposition that lets us see how fundamentally different they are, and yet at the same time teaches us how interdependent they are, each on the other, which of course helps us understand why it was possible for the neoclassical revolution to be able to focus on one in order to erase the other. Marx is about to show us, and I'll take us through it, how the production of surplus, the appropriation of surplus, is buried inside, although it is radically different from, the exchange of commodities, money, and all of that. And it'll become then very easy to explain how and why the neoclassicals not only missed that interaction, but used the interaction to literally make the production step invisible. Sharama, you're muted.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Thank you. I wanted to ask you the following question. When me and my friends were taught this stuff by Steve Resnick, I asked Steve the following question, and I'm going to ask you the same question. How would you respond to the following idea that when people such as myself who are reading this stuff on their own, for example, when they read volume 2, how would you respond to the following idea that the different circuits that Marx is now talking about, can they be mapped onto actually existing firms? Here's what I mean. So for example, when he's talking about the circuit of productive capital, in my mind, I'm thinking of a company in Bangladesh that actually manufactures the stuff, or a company in China that actually converts the inputs into the output. And when he's talking about the circuit of retail or commodity capital, I'm thinking of Walmart And when he's talking, is that the right way of approaching or thinking about this problem, just to make it simpler as someone who wants to use this in their analysis? How would you respond to that kind of way of
Yes,
thinking about it?
I think I can show you in a moment when we go through it. I can show you how the general notion that Marx captures in one kind of symbolic algebraic phrase allows you not only to distinguish the different kinds of capitalists, because that's really what you're asking. How is the producer of a product similar and also different from a bank that lends money or a merchant that buys and sells, buying at one price and selling at a? How do you accommodate these different capitalists? Because that's how Marx refers to them. How do you accommodate them within the larger interaction of banking, merchant, and what Marx calls industrial capital, namely the capital that literally produces the commodity that embodies a surplus? But he'll go more. He'll show you that the different circuits also correspond to the different theories. That what distinguishes Marx is his grasp of the totality, whereas what the neoclassicals do is only see part of it. They are so determined not to acknowledge exploitation that they cannot see production becomes irrelevant, indiscernible, an invisibility located in a black box. That's literally what my professors told me. Something engineers care about, but we don't need to. It's given by technology, which is some exogenously developing matter of human creativity or something else like that. And he also will show us, and I'll do that, how it captures what the classical political economists, Smith and Ricardo, what they saw, because they saw other things, but they didn't see the surplus. So he'll show you how he is different from both the classicals and the neoclassicals. It's as if that early section, the circuits of capital, or what he sometimes calls the metamorphoses of capital, are also a summary course in different economic theories, because there you'll see how the Marxian, how the neoclassical, how the classical, and by classical, by the way, I would include the Keynesian, how they are different.
Wow. So in other words, what you're saying is that the circuits of capital at once provide us with a way of thinking about the various vantage points as well. So in one sense, we're looking at the story from the vantage point of the merchant, right? And we're trying to understand why, for example, this economist or James Stewart came up with the markup theory of profits, because that's what the merchant looks at. That's his world. That's fascinating. And moreover, it's also interesting that you brought this up, because, I mean, when you look at the international struggles between countries, right? In international courts of disputes, for example, China wants to claim that more of the value should be retained in that country because they produce the surplus value, as does India, for example. And Sweden says, no, we want a greater share because we sold it and we financed it. Right. So those struggles also play out in the international arena. So that's fascinating.
Let me also add that, and this is having to do with, again, with Engels and Kautsky having contributed. That section early in volume 2 that we're talking about is a preliminary, just like the discussion in volume 1 about there it's called the difference between money and capital. When Marx teaches us in volume 1 that if money simply enables my tomatoes that I grew to be exchanged for money, which I then use to buy the potatoes you grew, then money is a means of exchange. But all of that are equal exchanges. I want 10 hours worth of my tomatoes to be exchanged for at least 10 hours worth of your potatoes. Only when money is used to make more money, that you end up with more, then money is being used as capital, right? That is now going to be elaborated brilliantly, but in volume 2. And what we have just said about volume 2 will then be elaborated very extensively in volume 3, where there is an immense discussion of what money lending is all about. When you lend a sum and you get back that same sum, the principal plus more, the interest, thereby making your money function as capital, and how that is a process in which no surplus is produced by anybody for anybody. So you have to understand that different. In neoclassical economics, such things are impossible. They don't appear.
Wow.
It isn't a subtle difference. It's an enormous difference. By the way, the same is true for merchant capital, where Marx accounts for how we can understand that in a system which celebrates the exchange of equivalents, the merchant lives by selling at a higher price what he has purchased at a lower price. This is an unequal exchange. And your mention of Stuart was among the pre-Marxian economists who thought that profit was something that happened in exchange. Part of the celebration of the market is because you have attributed to the market the magical capacity to produce a surplus, which means you don't have to credit the worker for having done that. It's fundamentally simple ideological predilection that's at work here, which is why in modern economics, it is so rare to find even a course in a graduate program devoted, for example, to the ideology of economics. No. One has to present economics as some neutral, non-ideological, absolute objective science, which is, beyond silly, unnecessary, not for them. Because here's the irony: the insistence on the non-ideological character of their approach is an urgent necessity of their ideological approach, which is they've got it right and everybody else is wasting our time. There is no recognition, no place. By the way, it's quite interesting. If you take a course, a graduate program in history, which I've done, you have a course required of most graduate students called historiography, in which you are taken through by a teacher the different ways history has been conceptualized. We don't all do it the same. We don't all look at the same data. We don't look at it in the same way. We don't gather it into arguments in the same way. And therefore, people studying ancient Rome can and have come up with radically different understandings of what was going on. And you're taught this. You're taught to be sensitive. We don't do that. If the course exists at all, it exists as a history of economic thought. And the teacher then tells you, this is what Ricardo wrote. We don't read that anymore. This is what Adam Smith wrote. We don't bother with that anymore. And, you have a little bit of exposure to the big names, but there's no notion of a contested terrain of alternative visions. And that just speaks to the inadequacy of conventional economics as it is taught, at least in most of the leading universities of the West. And sadly to say, that's often copied in the East.
Well, that's so true. And things haven't changed at all. I mean, neoclassical economics in neoclassical departments, it's business as usual. I mean, despite the crises and the tribulations and economics' inability to explain any of it, they're happy, they're merry with their regression coefficients, and things are well in the world where you can model everything. Anyway, so speaking of mathematics, um, I prepared a couple of slides with Marx's circuits of capital, which make some people nervous. So, to ease those nerves, we have the number one Marxian economist with us. Um, would it be okay if I asked you to explain? I'm going to just put those slides on the for our viewers, and if it's okay for you to help us understand and make sense of uh, these equations or these algebraic representations that Marx is using. So,
Yes. Yes, let's do that. And then I can not only explain what Marx's argument is, but show you how he encompasses the radical difference between his perspective and the alternative economics around him. Okay? So look at this little expression and follow with me as I explain what the letters mean, and you'll see it's very simple. All right, for Marx, this is how he represents the capitalist system that he explained to us in volume 1. And that's at the bottom of this slide, where you see that production involves buying, the capitalist buys means of production and labor power in the market. He goes into the market, he buys means of production. All that is tools, equipment, raw material, the building in which the production occurs, and so on. So the capitalist begins by making an exchange of commodities. He takes, I'm going to use the male pronoun for all the bad reasons that it's the norm in our system. He starts with money. That's the letter M. And the dash means he exchanges it for a commodity. Whatever the money is worth, 100 of whatever it is, pounds, dollars, euros, rupees, it doesn't matter. Money for commodity. And the reason you have the brackets is I want you to understand what are the commodities that our capitalist buys. MP stands for means of production. That means tools, equipment, raw materials, every non-human object purchased in the market. The capitalist also uses another part of his M, his money, what he's investing in this business, to purchase labor power, to hire workers. So the whole process starts with M exchanged for C, purchasing means of production and labor power in the market. Then the dash lines going to the letter P, P stands for production. Production is when the capitalist combines the means of production he purchased with the labor power he hired or purchased. He puts them together in an act of production that leads to an output. And the output is symbolized by the letter C with the little prime next to it. C is a commodity. The large letter C is always a commodity. And the only reasons it has a prime next to it is because it is different both qualitatively and quantitatively from the initial C. How is it qualitatively different? Well, think of the production of a chair. The means of production are wood and a hammer and glue and nails and all of that. And the labor power are the workers who put the tools together to convert the wood into a chair. The C prime is the output, is the chair. We have to have the prime so that everybody's clear. It's a different commodity from those that went. It's the output commodity, whereas the earlier C are the input commodities. Then our capitalist, having achieved the output, also wants us to understand that this commodity has in it more value. That's the quantitative difference. C prime is not only different, output different from input, it's also larger than the earlier C because it has accrued more value. And you all know, if you've been with us in earlier discussions, that that's the surplus. In production, the worker adds value by the labor she or he performs. Whatever the value in the means of production was, the labor power that is purchased has added value as the capitalist consumed that labor power. And by consuming labor power, I mean putting it to work with the means of production. And then finally, our capitalist sells the output, the chair in my example, and he realizes an amount of money, M, from the sale of the chair, where M is money and therefore different from C, but it's the same. These are equal exchanges. There's no magic here. The reason this M has a prime because it's the same value as that output. And that output has a higher value than the inputs because of surplus. And you can symbolize what M prime means. It's M, the money that the capitalist started with, plus delta M, or the growth of M, thanks to the surplus produced and appropriated by the capitalist in production. All right, now let's comment on this, and I'll do this the way Marx does. You'll see it in volume 2, but, in my modern English, with a focus on all of the insights that derive from this. So, first, understand the vulnerability of capitalism. Every transaction here depends on circumstance. The capitalist who has money may not find in the market the means of production or the labor power. If everybody's working, where's it going to get the labor power? How's he going to get it? Same thing here. If somebody who owns the means of production is for whatever reason, unwilling to sell it, this system breaks down. That's the first thing. And we have to be very careful because it turns out there are all kinds of circumstances where this system will break down. Okay, next, I'll come back to it. Let's assume our capitalist can buy means of production and can hire workers. Now he has to put them together. He has to have those workers add more value in production than he had to pay them in LP, in the value he gave them to be there. We talked about this in terms of volume 1, where that point is worked out. But there is no necessity that happens. For example, if workers studied Marxian economics from the time they were 5 years old, they would say, wait a minute, we add the value by our labor, but we only get the value of the labor power we sell, which is equal to the commodities we buy, multiplied each one by the amount of labor it takes. So what the capitalist is eventually going to realize as delta M is revealed by Marx now where it comes from. It doesn't come from the first step because that's a simple exchange, money for input commodities. And it doesn't come out of the second step, selling the output for money, because that's an exchange of equivalence too. Yes, there is a growth in money at the end, so we know we have to do with capital, but it cannot be, should not be accounted for as if it were the product of exchange. This is, at the time Marx does this, this is revolutionary. Okay, now, how can this help us understand other ways of thinking? Imagine with me a person, very understandable, who looks at this and who says, wait a minute, we started with a purchase of one kind of good, and we ended up with a different kind of good. Why would people get involved in doing that? Well, the answer is they don't like having all of this means of production and labor power. They really want output. They want shares. And we could say this whole thing is about an exchange of what one person wants for something they want more. In other words, this whole thing is about utility. Human beings possessed of this want that. They're possessed of the input commodities, but they would like to have, and workers have nothing to complain about because what they offer for sale is labor power, which you can't eat. But you can eat hamburgers and they will get paid an amount of money that will enable them to get what they enjoy by giving up what they enjoy less. So they're giving up less utility for more utility. In fact, there are some neoclassical economists who, utilizing Marxism, even though they're not aware they're doing so, refer to what I just described as the consumer's surplus. The consumer, being better off, got rid of a less useful object, his capacity or her capacity to work, and obtained, by parting with it, by selling it, he obtained a more useful object. Therefore, the whole of economics, including the employer-employee relationship, can be understood in the model of why I, with my tomatoes, gave up 10 hours worth of them for your potatoes, because I like potatoes better than tomatoes. You like tomatoes better than potatoes. Our exchange was motivated by the qualitative difference, and that's the only one that really counts. Okay, neoclassical economics comes very close to what I just said. It's a system. That's why if you begin a course in neoclassical economics, in many cases, you will begin by being taught the concept of the indifference curve. This is designed to show you how a person who feels about tomatoes and potatoes in a particular way, whatever way that is, or who feels about their own labor effort versus hamburgers, however they do, will now enter the capitalist economy with the same objective everybody else does. Exchange that which you value less for something you value more. And it's not an exchange of equivalence. It is an exchange that makes you better off. This is so crucial. It means all exchanges are mutually beneficial. Or in modern lingo, it's a win-win situation that we have here at the core of cap. Notice the production of surplus, in the way Marx defined it, vanished. It's not there. if they recognize that there's a P, which mostly they do, then that's in a technological matter. That's just a clever capitalist who knows that under certain circumstances, when you put this and this and that together, you get more output. We'll be taught that this is the lesson human beings learned when they stopped eating all of the plants growing in a field by realizing that so many plants were grown that if you took only a small number of them, you'd get enough seeds to have the same crop next year. So you could eat this year and still have next year because you learned that. You know what that's about? That's about the biological capacity of a set of plants to produce grain and seeds, allowing an endless growth of output because of the marvelous quality of nature. And this is physiocratic. This is pre-Marx. It's the notion that in the agriculture there is yes, you have to use part of the corn to as seed, and you need part of the corn to feed the workers who cultivate the seed and do all the rest. But the amazing thing is that when you take the corn you need to feed everybody and the corn you need for seed, you can produce even more corn next year than you did. And this is explained when human beings figured this out. They discovered how to harness nature for the advancement of the human community. And to this day, that way of thinking prevails. People actually believe that technology is what does it for us as a species. Now, I'm not taking away from the relevance of technology, but it's the technology that was crucial. Corn was producing what it produced today thousands of years ago, and we didn't have anything like the society sustained by corn that we have now. It ain't the corn, it's the people who interact with one another in a certain way that allows all of this to happen. The ability of people to cultivate that corn, in my language or Marx's language, to produce a surplus. In other words, an amount of corn that is enough to feed them while they raise the corn, plus a surplus, will now allow people to do all kinds of other things because they live off the surplus. And you know what the things are they're going to do? They're going to invent a tractor which will virtually double the amount of surplus corn we can. That's the history of the human race. That's what we did. It was the surplus, figuring out what it was, where it was, who got it, and whether that person either had feast days where they consumed the surplus, in which case civilization didn't grow, or they sustained a group of people who figured out how to make a tractor or make a stick that you hit the corn with, or invent a powder that you keep the animals from the corn, etc., etc. Now let's take a look briefly at the following. You can look at the whole thing from the point of view of production. And if you look at it from the point of view of production, then you say this whole thing, the economy, you see, starts with means of production and workers. And the question is, what brings them together so that they can be productive? What will make them able to use tools, equipment, raw materials, and work to produce more than they put in to the product? And that then becomes the magic. And that magic can become, for example, articulated as entrepreneurial spirit. What? Yes. This is wonderful because it gives to whoever brings the means of production and the labor power together in the workshop, whoever is in a position to do that is the celebrated one, because that skill, bringing that together, gives us the greater output. Notice there's no conception of a surplus here. There is no surplus. In the technology, like in the seeds, there's the capacity to grow more than you need to feed the grower. There has to be a surplus somewhere. They locate it in nature. They locate it in technology. But what makes it all happen becomes a different story. For Marx, the story is the whole thing. And notice, and here comes really important stuff. For Marx, in order for surplus to happen during the letter P, there has to be an equal exchange beforehand. In other words, a condition of existence of surplus, what he focuses on, is exchange. The surplus doesn't happen in the exchange, but if the exchange doesn't happen, you won't get a surplus. So there is no denigration of exchange. There's none of the magically it disappears. Marx didn't have the ideological drive that the neoclassics, they needed to make his story disappear. He wanted to contextualize their story so that people understood it was a different perspective, but it wasn't necessary to accept it because one could see its ideological function. And likewise, look at the end. There's another exchange of the output commodity for money. That exchange has to happen. If for any reason it doesn't happen, the capitalist cannot, in Marx's language now, realize the surplus that's embodied in the output, that was captured, arranged, appropriated in production. But for the capitalist, that is horrible. The capitalist system can be broken down if either of the exchanges, that has to happen before it and that has to happen after it, are prevented, blocked, interfered with. Now, for those of you who study Keynesian economics, we can represent that very clearly here. That's when C prime can't find a buyer. That's insufficient effective demand, to use Keynes's language. That will happen if the working class doesn't have enough income. If the ruling class, the bourgeois, have the income but don't want to spend it. Maybe they're so freaked out by the uncertainties around them, the way President Trump walks back every tariff 10 minutes after he announces it, then they might be so freaked out by the uncertainty that they'll hold back buying outputs, in which case capitalists are plunged into a crisis. If they can't sell it to M, then they can't resume the circuits of capital, start all over. That M prime being the next circuit's M. And they have to endlessly do it because they're all doing it. And they all need to hold some of the DM. They have to hold it back as a rainy day fund. What do I mean? Well, suppose the price of means of production go up. Suppose suddenly Saudi Arabia decides to raise the price of oil. That's an input. Suddenly they don't have enough money to buy the oil they need because the price has shot up. If they have a surplus they've held aside, they can turn to the surplus they've held aside, dip into it, and use it to keep the circuit going, because that way they can keep appropriating surplus upon which their future depends. So they need to get the surplus in order to keep getting the surplus. They need to have it, to keep it, to be able to use it, to keep getting it. And volume 3 is where Marx systematically explores all of the ways capitalists use and distribute the surplus in order to keep this circuit going.
Wow, that is amazing, Professor Wolff. The circuits of capital approach that Marx has decided to use in Capital provides us with a befitting graphical, pictorial understanding of visual understanding of how Marx conceptualizes the project. Firstly, between two equal exchanges, the act of buying and the act of selling, we see the act that is hidden in the hidden abode of production, i.e., class exploitation. Moreover, as Professor Wolff explained so brilliantly, we also see within the circuit of capital approach the possibilities, the multiple possibilities of crises with which capitalism is always confronting. All right, guys, unfortunately, we've run out of time, but in the next episode, I'm going to return to the following problem with Professor Wolff. How can we convert volumes 2 and 3 into an analysis of subsumed class struggles? Go back to our discussion in season 1, where Professor Wolff explained how he and Steve Resnick, in this lovely book called Knowledge and Class, explained a theory via which we have a more complex understanding of class struggles in the real world. Don't miss that episode. All right, guys, as always, I hope you got something out of it. The philosophers have only interpreted the world. The point, however, is to change it. I'll see you all in the next episode. Thank you.